So hi everybody and welcome to this Inspire and Be Inspired session run by Champions for Earth. We've got a great lineup today, starting with Erchana, Murray-Bartlett, I should say probably. An epic tale of 150 consecutive marathons. I still can't quite wrap my head around it. From the tip of Australia right down to this most southern point, right? And not only setting a world record, but also raising over $100,000 for Australian wildlife, which is awesome. So we're going to hear from Erchana, and then we'll go into a Q&A type discussion run by Laura. So keep your questions in mind, but also if you feel better about it, you can put them in the chat and we'll make sure we get to them if and when we have time. So that's all from me. I'm going to pass over to you, Erchana, for these.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction as well. It's exciting that the world that we live in now, that you can have these chats anywhere in the world. So it's, first thing in the morning here in my hometown of the Gold Coast in Burleigh Heads, Australia. So thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here, and I'm looking forward to sharing a bit of my story. I'm what is it, the 22nd, so I'm just over 2 months finished what was a bit of a dream run for me. I traditionally have been a runner since my mid-20s. I went to college playing soccer, so my entire kind of early development was all around soccer. And where I grew up, it's called the Yarra Valley in regional Victoria. It's a long way from anywhere, but it's a really beautiful wild place, and there's so it's off the base of a few national parks, and it's very green and vibrant with wildlife. And I grew up there, and sort of it turned me into who I am today. So then I went off and did all my kind of 20s things. I traveled and played soccer in the US and in London and in Reading at Reading University. Came home at 23 and needed something different. I needed something new, and I wanted to meet people. So across the road from the tiny apartment that I could afford in Melbourne was an athletics track. And I'd always been better at running, if I was really honest with myself, than football. And, I was one of those players where I started in the midfield and then went out to the wing because I was just, able to run up and down, and then eventually just got rid of the ball altogether. So I went across the track and fell in love with running instantly. But because, of my football background, it was the shorter stuff. I was doing 400 meters upwards to about 10K, half marathon at a stretch. My coach kept telling me, Erchana, your body is designed to be a marathon runner. Like I said, I grew up in this regional part of Victoria, and my entire life I just spent running and exploring. It's just who I am. And eventually over the years built up enough to do a marathon, and hated it. I only got 30 kilometers in, and I was going way too fast, completely blew, could barely, and just sat down at the side of the road at 30 kilometers. So it was a failed first attempt, but what it did show me was the camaraderie within the sport. And that's because as soon as I started to slow down, everybody rallied around me, and they would pick me up and give me their gels or give me their water bottle or whatever they had to try and get me through it, even though if it was a detriment to their event. And I thought, this is an amazing sport. What a team competition. And so I kind of dusted myself off and tried again, and eventually got there, and over the years fell in love with it. And so here I was running pretty competitively at the marathon distance, and COVID hit, and I had all this extra thinking time to think about what made me happy, and because everything was taken away. And what it boiled down to was the wilderness and the outdoors, because when I wasn't running or working, I was hiking or I was somewhere in the bush, and running. They were the two things, besides obviously relationships and friends and family, that personally lit my fire. And I thought back to a small childhood dream I had, where I would usually try and race my parents to a local cafe, or I would try and get my own fastest time up the local mountain. And I've always kind of set myself challenges. And one of those challenges was to run the length of the country. But the romanticized idea of my childhood dream was very different to the reality of running a marathon every day, from the top of the country to the bottom. And then, yeah, during COVID, when I had this extra thinking time, I thought, this is it. I'm, the fittest I've ever been. I'm the best positioned, financially and with my self-confidence to do this. But also, born from that time growing up was this why. And now my why was unfortunately, Australia is in the midst of an extinction crisis for our native animals and our wildlife, animals and plants. And we're world leaders in deforestation rates, behind the Amazon, and we have over almost 500 animals on the endangered list. And these are globally significant animals like the koala, and it's all climate related events. We had these horrific fires right before COVID hit, and one of the big shames for COVID in Australia was the fires that absolutely decimated species. They didn't get any attention because the second the spotlight was on them, I mean, they did, sorry, they got a lot of global attention, but then immediately COVID hit and there was everyone's attention changed for years. And those fires are now a long forgotten trauma that no one really remembers. And then through all 2022, it was floods, and it just got worse and worse. And I thought, what, if I've got this personal challenge and this kind of childhood dream to run this length of the country, why don't I do it for a reason that's more important to me, and that's protecting Australian wildlife. And more broadly, it's protecting the wild places that home these animals and these species. So I partnered with the Wilderness Society, who are a Tasmanian-born charity, and so what they're doing is they're fighting to unite people to protect nature. So they do that for marine and forests, and they've been really successful in the past. If you do get a chance, there's a documentary called The Franklin River. It's the original fight to save the Franklin River and the forest surrounding that. So my goal was to raise $10 per kilometre from the top to the bottom, and that would have been around 63,000 Australian dollars. But thankfully we were able to double that, and it's still growing through some kind of follow-up fundraisers. So that was one key component of it. The second key component was raising awareness as I go, because globally but even worse in Australia, people don't actually understand that we have this crisis to Australian animals. They there's so much going on in the world that it's not on the forefront of anyone's minds. So as I was running down the country, the way the bird flies is 3,800 kilometers. I'm not sure what that is in miles, but it follows the Bruce Highway. It's straight down. And so it only would have taken me 60 to 70, maybe 80 days. But my plan to hit 150, and this is because everybody always asks me, why did you go so far over the previous record? I'm off on a tangent here, but the previous record that I was trying to beat was 106 marathons in a row, and my aim was 150, and that's because I wanted to stay off the main road and hit the east coast and go inland and essentially pick out the national parks and wild places as I descended, because running down a road is not highlighting why we need to keep wild places wild. So I would kind of zigzag the entire way down, sometimes come back up to try and really showcase the beauty of the Australian outback and why we need to protect it. And that was really rewarding for me as well, because I got to explore these places that not many people would go and see in some really remote parts of Australia. And it had ups and downs, because sometimes it was just me on my own in this outback wilderness with no reception, hardly any water, and there's crocs in every river. So there was obviously safety concerns, but I don't know, I was so invested, and I just love the wildlife so much. I just went out and did it, and eventually made it to Melbourne. I mean, so much went wrong, and we could have entire Q&A on what went wrong. I had a lot of sponsors, but I wasn't able to secure a car sponsor. So I had a finite budget for this, so I bought a Prado big enough to be able to carry everybody in the support. So we were pulling a trailer that was an off-road trailer, so I could get anywhere I want, anywhere we needed to go, and then we could fill it with tents and water and everything. But that Prado broke down I don't know how many times. So sometimes I would get to my rendezvous point and there'd be no one there because the car just hadn't been able to start. Sometimes I'd get to a rendezvous point and it was on the wrong side of a river and no one would be there. And these are in areas with no phone reception. So there was one particular day where I ended up having to hitchhike to where I thought everyone was, because I'd hit 42 Ks on my watch, but there was a big detour. So the rendezvous point was 67 Ks south. Don't know how it happened. And I can't get in cars with my GPS watch because that would have ruined the, you can tell if you're in a car, your speed goes from 5-minute Ks to 2-minute flat, and, Garmin can see pretty clearly you're not running. So yeah, I ended up having to wait for hours and hours and hours just by the side of the road on the outback after finishing, no food, no water, for someone to finally get help. So there's definitely things, if I was to do it again, I would do differently. But I think the naivety of it was part of the reason I was able to just run, because had I have known how dusty and corrugated the roads were, and how every time a truck goes past, it just blows up infinite dust, and you sort of have to run with a face mask, not for COVID, but for the dust in the lungs. And, as you get further south, I ran through magpie season, which is a very aggressive bird for 3 months of the year. So I got swooped, 4 or 5 times per run with these magpies just coming down to me. And I'm like, team, I'm running for nature. Leave me be. I'm out here protecting, your habitat. They didn't care. So with everything though, one of the highlights of it was that I put every day, I put where I was starting on social media. And so as the expedition grew, more and more people would join me at that start line. So, it would start with 1 person and 2 people, 3 people. And on the final run, it was such a large crowd. So getting everybody involved through such a beautiful sport, such an easy sport to get into, such an inclusive sport, in terms of your ability. I mean, everyone that any background ability was able to come out and join me. So that's kind of the summary. I'll have a bit of a pause for talking and see if there's any questions, because there's probably a lot. I've given you in the time limit a lot of highlights, but yeah, the end result was 150 marathons back to back, 6,330 kilometers. I summited Everest the equivalent of 8 times, which sounds like a lot, but over 6 months, Australia has some long, flat areas. There was one marathon where my elevation was 6 meters, and that's only because my feet lifted off the ground a few centimeters every time. In saying that, there was also some large hills. I had, I think, about 630,000 calories of predominantly bananas and rice. And yeah, we raised 130,000 for at-risk Australian wildlife. I went through 10 pairs of Tarkine runners. So Tarkine is an environmentally eco-friendly running shoe that's just launched over in Western Australia. They donate profits to the Tarkine forest in Tasmania, but also use recycled material to make their shoes. So all in all, I think that's it, but I will leave it for any questions.